Thanks everybody for coming out on opening day here in Detroit. I just want to do a quick round of thank yous before we jump into our discussion. I want to thank the Cezanne Benetier team, Ingrid Lundgren who's here, Ellie Rhymes who's here, Luc Guerrier in Paris, who helped a lot, Bernard Cezanne, Francois Cezanne, and Louis Benetier. Of course, our panelists. It's a huge thing to have you guys here to talk about this subject. The MOCAD team, which has been really supportive and wonderful to get to know and work with. Alicia, Zeb Smith, Tim Johnson, Amy Coral, Christine Hillebrand, Michael Go, and whoever else I have left off the list, but I just want to thank everybody for being such a great host and working so hard on the show and bringing it to fruition. I want to thank the artists, none of whom are here, but I think it's worth reading their names. Andre Pierre Arnault, Vincent Boulez, Pierre Baraglio, Louis Kahn, Marc Devad, Dano Dezuz, Noël Dola, Tony Grand, Jean-Michel Maurice, Bernard Pagès, Jean-Pierre Pinsman, Patrick Seytour, Andre Valenci, and Claude Villa. So I think as a group we kind of conceive this as a discussion between the three of us, and I just wanted to avail ourselves of the knowledge that's sitting to my right here, and I think that may be the most interesting way to go about a discussion about a group of artists who are very diverse and also shared a lot in common. The show, as I did it became kind of an exercise, as I was doing it, of making something clean out of something that is messy. This group, this movement, was always in a state of flux. There were arguments and tensions and excommunications and all kinds of frictions between the members. And who was a member, who wasn't, what kind of art was acceptable to make and what kind of art wasn't. I was chatting with Raphael just before this, and he suggested the idea that maybe this was the last avant-garde movement, and maybe we can eventually get back to that idea, what makes this Support Surface actually possibly the last avant-garde movement. Certain aspects of the work that I think is in common or is shared is this idea of painting and what painting is, the idea of pulling painting apart and finding component parts and displaying them. So we have things like paintings without stretchers, paintings without imagery, showing strictly the stretcher as a painting or an art object. But then there's a lot that's retained inside of that, things like color, form, certain organizational properties within the artwork itself. And then abstraction is this issue that's hanging over this entire show and this body of work. In their hands, abstraction was an incredibly precise language. And that's something, as I was working with the work, I gradually became more and more aware of the fact that they were so specific and precise about the use of whatever it was they were dealing with in terms of material or drawing or any other kind of properties of the work. And it's also, I think, part of the show that was really exciting for me was to kind of work with a lot of the documentation of some of the early exhibitions. They were very keen to display their work outside the boundaries of like a traditional museum or gallery space. And in the vitrines, I encourage everybody to go and take a look at the black and white photos of different shows that they staged. And then also they were very involved with writing, and they had a publication. I hope we can talk about that a little bit more as well, about their ideas and manifestos, and again, we have in those vitrines examples of the original documents and stuff, and it's worth checking out because it seems very an unusual part of the movement. And I just wanted to sort of finish off by mentioning, before I forget, that in the Brooklyn Rail that just came out, Raphael published an interview he did with Pierre Braglio, who was one of the artists in the show. And if you get a chance, it's really worth reading. The back and forth seems very natural, and it kind of really pulls out a lot about particularly Pierre's contribution to the movement. And he wasn't exactly an official member, but there was obviously a lot that he had in common with the more official members, but and there was reasons for him not being an official member, and I think that's also worth talking about. And I just wanted to end with it was just a fragment of a quote that I've been kind of playing over in my head all day, where Pierre talks about the banality of success. And I just thought that as an artist, the idea of success being banal applies so much to this show. Like, they ended up in this kind of creative train wreck, but it is so interesting and so powerful. The fact that it's an incredible gift that they didn't succeed in what they were trying to accomplish, because the result is so full of energy and thought-provoking. So with that, that's kind of where I want to leave my little intro, and maybe we can kick it over to, let's see, who should, maybe Rachel, you have some.
I think as being not French, but like representing Frenchness here, I have kind of a question to ask both of you, which is, I know why I'm interested in Surpassing, and actually I'm interested in it because I'm not French. And the first time I saw this work was in 1991.
Can you pull the mic closer to your mouth?
With pleasure. Is that good? You're welcome. I first encountered this work in the first historical show of Surpassing in 1991 when Bernard Cesson, the curator of the Museum of Modern Art in a town called Saint-Étienne, organized this kind of retrospective of this work, and it hit me, because I'm American, as something extraordinary, because it looked like art that I grew up with, and at the same time it was different and I'd never heard of it, and it blew me away because I thought it was so exceptional visually and plastically. And I know that Raphael and I have something in common, which is Bernard Cesson, because he is in a way a mentor to both of us in different ways. But Whitney, and both of you nonetheless, I'm interested in what it was that creates this spark where you think this is work that I have to know a lot more about, and it touches me in a visceral way, which is the only interesting response I think we can have to visual art.
Well, for me personally, I think it is this idea of a hidden history that wasn't designed to be secret, but it was something I came to maybe 10 years ago, and it just hit me as something I've been looking for in my entire life as a painter, and it was just that clear that.
Give some details.
Well, I was sitting in an office in France, and Bernard had approached me to do a show, and I didn't know anything about him, and I decided to go meet him. I was in Paris for some reason, and I sat down.
Which Bernard are we talking about?
Bernard Cesson. And
so we're all influenced by this.
Yeah, we are. We really are. At least I am. And he was a very self-effacing, not very demonstrative person, man of few English words. He had about 20 minutes of English in him a day, and most of that was like that was mostly about The Searchers or Western movies. Like, he was obsessed with cowboy movies. ways, and I am not, and I was sort of nod along and talk to him about it. And, you know, I went and I just had never really considered French art beyond sort of Matisse as being kind of anything I needed to pay attention to. And which I think is really typical of my generation. I think it just stopped at a certain point, and it was about right around where Matisse was, or Picasso, or something like that. And I was sitting in the office, and across the way there was this unstretched painting, very colorful, with this sort of abstract form in the middle of it. And I was very, you know, confident in my position as an American painter coming to France, very sure of my position, and I said, "What is that?" I'm like, I don't know, it's just, you know, it's a painting. I was like, "Who made it?" And then it was Claude's painting, Claude Villard. And I couldn't get it out of my head, and I just began to be curious as to why it wasn't part of my education or anything that I was really aware of. And then it's gradually dawned on me that he was a part of this bigger picture. And it was this kind of thing that seemed to resonate with me so much, and it has something to do with the underdog status of a group of artists who are extremely political, yet embraced painting as something significant, worth doing, and not like, you know, you could be political and be a painter at the same time, which was such an odd concept to me. I thought if you were political, you made video art, or you did sort of actions, or you did certain things that were not painting. And I definitely knew I was a painter. I was very involved with painting. And then it just, as I gradually understood it, I sort of saw the value of it. So that was, and here we are today. And yeah.
So my discovery was the same. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Do you want to hang on to him, like, I can pass you the microphone.
Oh, that definitely works. Okay, so I discovered Support Surpass at the same exhibition as Rachel at Saint Etienne in 1991. There we go. And like Rachel and like Wallace, I was an American who, well, I knew, you know, a fair amount about post-war French art, and I was aware of, I guess, only one artist from the group, Claude Villard. I had really no sense of what Support Surpass was, and that exhibition in this very large museum, one of the things that I remember striking me was here were like 12 artists whose work had such a strong, interesting mutual entanglement. There were so many, like sometimes, at least in the beginning, I couldn't tell like a Noël Dolat from Claude Villard, from Patrick Seytour. I mean, now that I've gotten to know them much better, I can distinguish them, but I think maybe you will have the same experience as you walk into this exhibition, is that in some ways it's a whole. It's like, and they really are. I had the sense that this was a movement, and Wallace said that I said to him that this, I feel like maybe this was the last avant-garde, and you know, there certainly have been like movements in art since then, since the 1970s, but to have a real avant-garde, you need a number of things, and I think you need a sense of mission, a sense that our art is, you know, we're positioning ourselves against the world. There are things we're dissatisfied with that we want to change through our art, but also through our actions. And you know, and an avant-garde movement writes manifestos, and the Support Surpass people wrote a lot. You can see in some of the publications in the vitrines here. They were very polemical. They were, you know, they had, you know, fights with each other, and they, you know, people were expelled, and that sense of taking yourself really seriously, and also having a really cohesive aesthetic is something that I feel I don't really see that happening. Maybe someone will remind me of examples since the 1970s that I'm not thinking of, but so that was one of the things that really struck me, as well as the fact that, as you say, like I hadn't been aware of this work, and why was that?
Yeah.
And I think to me, one of the really interesting things about Support Surface is that if you think back into the 1960s and 70s, French intellectual culture had a huge impact in this country and around the world through philosophy, through post-structuralism, through Jacques Derrida and Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault and Jacques Lacan, and all of these, the artists in the US and writers and academics and in all these different fields enthusiastically embraced French intellectual discourse. But when it came to French art, there was like an embargo, and there's this lingering, still to this day, I think in some ways, a lingering bias and prejudice on the part of the American audience, particularly in New York, against French art. And that, I think that kind of disjunction between, the enthusiastic welcome to post-structuralism and the rejection or just ignoring of Support Surface is interesting. And what makes it even more interesting is that Support Surface was deeply, deeply influenced and engaged with exactly the same philosophers that were, taking American academia by storm. So that kind of disjunction.
Yeah, it
I
seemed
found
like,
interesting.
I was much more familiar with German post-war painters like Kiefer, Richter, Osleitz, these people that were essentially the same generation, and it always struck me as, like, why am I so familiar with these artists, and I have absolutely no idea, basically about any French painter of that, or artist of that period.
Would you like me to try and give you
Yes.
an explanation?
I love it.
I think it's very complicated to study another culture, way harder than you think, and it can't really happen from the outside. French theory made it to the United States on the backs of academics, and it was disseminated quite easily through the network of academia. French art, in order to have that same resonance, would have had to have a network to go through. And Americans, artists and galleries were not at that time open to it for different reasons. For one thing, they didn't recognize similarities or stuff that they wanted to grab onto, say, like Nouveau Realisme with Nikita Saint-Phage, Jean Tinguely, Armand, César. Those artists were able to break into the American view quite a bit easier because Americans, or Marcel Hayes, people like that, thought that they were pop artists. We had something and they were just copying us. The French Support Surface, it looked like American art to me, but for reasons that have to do with also already being very much imbibed in French culture. Moreover, they didn't have to break in to the American art world because the reason really to do that is to be famous and have a gallery and sell your work. But these artists all came from either because they came from very middle-class families or because they had perfectly good jobs. They were very supported in France, and their galleries didn't make very much effort to export them in the same way that the German galleries or the Italian galleries were exporting the Trans Avant-Garde or Arte Povera, or the French galleries were very, for one thing, the artists, most of them taught, so they had salaries every month. They didn't depend on their galleries for their stipends and things like that. And secondly, they started to really become comfortably ensconced in French culture at a period under the Lang Ministry of Culture, when there was an incredible amount of support to the arts, in particular visual arts, with the creation of a whole bunch of new collecting institutions, and their work was bought, and they didn't have that need they didn't have that hunger, I would say, as the generation before them, like the Nouveau Realistes did. They didn't come to New York very much, except with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 of them. So you had to find it in a way that is different.
But I think that sounds, that's really enlightening. I just want to add maybe either a footnote or a question. You know, I think it's true, as you say, that they, like the dynamics of the French art system didn't necessarily help them have access to New York. But I also think that when Support Surface began showing their work, this was in the wake of May '68, in a highly politically charged situation. And I'm just thinking about how a lot of their early exhibitions were not in galleries, were not in museums, but they were exhibitions that the artists organized themselves. They had them show the work on in the streets of little towns in southern France, or on the hillside, on the beach, or in public spaces that were not necessarily made for showing art. That I feel like they were they were identifying themselves or establishing themselves in a kind of cultural alternative space that eventually, they were certainly accepted and recognized and supported by the institutions, but I feel like in the beginning they were marking themselves out as outsiders from French mainstream art culture. And I feel like one of the things I like about this exhibition is it seems to have some of the qualities of the kind of improvised installations that they were doing in the late 60s and early 70s, as you can see from some of these shots that Rachel has brought.
That's definitely what attracted me. I mean, this idea of artists taking control over the means of distribution of their own work was very appealing to me, as somebody who is both a painter and somebody who has teamed up with other artists in order to kind of take control of that part of it, although limited and mixed results. I don't know if it's a totally tenable position today, but it seemed like very idealistic, and I really appreciated that. And then to hear Rachel say, well, they all had teaching jobs, and they were very well cared for in their homeland, it's a little bit of a letdown.
But I mean, the German artists had teaching jobs too.
Yeah.
They probably had better paid teaching jobs than the French.
Okay.
But I would say that it's really true what Raphael is saying. In the beginning, they didn't market themselves, so they couldn't be externalized or networked or shopped around or exported, because there wasn't anything to export and there wasn't an exporter. I mean, individual artists don't, except if they're very ambitious and they like to go and perform, they don't export themselves. It takes a gallery or a dealer to do that. So that is true. But by the time their work was completely unknown in France, except to themselves. Let's be realistic about this. If you look through the press clippings and all of their press books and stuff until the early 80s, if they ever did get any coverage, it was in the local newspaper. And they hadn't, there were only, the first show in which they exist as a group is in Paris at the Museum of Modern Art in the experimental section.
Wasn't that some of their decision? I mean, Louis Kahn would write screeds about how the most important art critic in France is an idiot and a moron, and just railing against the institution. So of course they were going to be, were they self-segregating themselves in a certain way, or is it just the atmosphere of the time?
And then just to mention Piero Buraglio, who in 1969, after May 68, stopped making art for 5 years and took a job in a factory, as a lot of French intellectuals were doing at the time, and ideas in relationship to the official art culture.
That probably leads into, I would love to get a little bit of a background of some of the political ideas of the group, because I know that A, we have these art objects, and B, we have kind of a political ideology, and I think it'd be great to kind of put it, touch on each of them with maybe an eye towards what made their work so potent.
I don't think that the images and the visual art has any relationship to their political positions. I think perhaps it was a political position not to show in museums, but there is no political content that I can discern in the actual things. Don't know if you agree with that.
I don't agree with that. And I mean, there's no content in the sense that there's no signs of references to any particular political position. So, but I think, like, if you look at this work, you see the work, and it's all, as Wallace said, it's abstract. It relates to a lot of kind of post-minimalist work that was being done in the United States, in other places in Europe. They were, one of their first influences, one of their major influences was American color field painting. And they were reading translations of articles by Clement Greenberg, and they were looking at Morris Louis. And at the same time, not all of them, but the core group, a number of the artists in Support Surface were not just leftists, not just Marxists, but they were Maoists. They were like part of that.
That's the kind of thing that always gets me confused. Like, what's a Maoist? What's a Marxist? What's the difference?
But I think that if they had articulated, whether you think it's kind of viable or not, they, at least some of them, Marc Devad and Louis Kahn, had a very detailed, thought out argument for why this work, which is apparently unpolitical and seems to just be exploring color and structure and material, actually has a revolutionary, radical message. And like, for instance, their ideas about color. They thought color had an ability to short circuit the kind of bourgeois capitalist mentality. And like, as we read,
is there a particular color that did that, or is it just any?
I'll tell
Red,
you why.
of course.
I'll tell you why I don't believe that is in any way true. We can't question Marc Devad anymore, who is certainly the most cogent writers, and even Louis Kahn, if you ask him, finally will admit that Marc Devad reviewed all of his texts before he published them. But we can talk to Louis Kahn, and we can talk to other of these artists. And today, someone like Louis Kahn will still tell you how important color is, but he no longer has any political argument about it. He has painterly and pictorial arguments. So I think one of the things that's most interesting about this show is that you're looking at incredibly strong work by young artists who have continued to have incredibly strong careers doing stuff that for some of them still looks like that, like Claude Viala, and doing stuff that looks nothing like that, like Louis Kahn, for instance. So it's easy to get wrapped up in the idea that they had all these ideas and they were energetic young men protesting the injustices of the world and still being male chauvinist pigs and still being basically having the bourgeois values of their parents. But we forgive them for that because the work is strong. And we forgive them that because the radical pictorial ideas hold up, regardless of how their political ideas have changed. And art exists in a continuum, that the same artist made it, and he changes, and the art changes, and we read it differently. But we have, I think it's important, and even you appreciate the work better if you look at it from 3 or 4 perspectives at once.
I think that's true, but I also think that, you know, the art is easier, it's more accessible because it doesn't need to be translated. I think, you know, whether these artists still believe or completely reject and have forgotten what they might have said 50 years ago, that the fact is that those texts exist, but they haven't been translated, they haven't been republished, they're still kind of locked up in archives. And I think that, you know, in order to really understand whether that's necessary to fully appreciate the work, it needs to be more accessible, and I think it just hasn't been accessible. And I think, you know, I know they're embarrassed about some of it, like, you know, as other French intellectuals at the time, like Louis Kahn now acknowledges that, like, you know, celebrating the Chinese Cultural Revolution, they had no idea that millions of people were dying, were being killed. And that, you know, but that was, I think this work emerged out of the contradictions of loving Matisse. You know, I think also the influence that a lot of them were from the south of France, so you see that. It's working with materials that were taken from their everyday environment, like Claude Viala working, like painting on tarps and drapes and cafe umbrellas, and Noël Dolat working with dish towels, and that's kind of artisanal side of it. And the fact that it was a highly politically charged moment. All of those things that make this work strange in a way. But I think one of the things that I find interesting to think about is that why, like, it was made 50 years ago. It's now, there's this exhibition here in Detroit. There was an exhibition a couple of years ago in Los Angeles, exhibitions in New York. This is work that was basically invisible, ignored in this country until very, very recently. And what has changed? And I think what's changed, I mean, when I think about that, the answer I come up with, I'd be interested to hear what both of you, Rachel and Wallace, have to say. I think it's because the work of contemporary artists working in this country resonates. There's a connection like that artists now can see, or people who are involved with contemporary art can see a relationship between what artists in their 20s or 30s or 40s are doing in this country right now with this work from 50 years ago. And it's not that they're influenced by it, because they didn't know about it. It's these affinities, this like strange historical time warp.
Yeah, that goes to what I was saying about having that epiphany in Bernard Cezanne's office and saying, I know that, but I've never seen it before. You know, that moment of recognition with language that you're very familiar with, used in a different way. And I think painters are always trying to extend what is a known territory. So there's this kind of layer of being anchored in tradition, and also it's imperative that you push further and try and claim a little bit of territory that isn't already known. So that seems like the job of the artist. And then I just want to respond quickly to what Rachel was saying about the politics. I totally understand where you're coming from, that the work exists maybe without the politics, and I think a lot of what the writings are maybe are dated, or they're not maybe as current as you were referring to, but there's something about the making of the work, the touch of the artist, which is embedded in pretty much every piece in the show. I mean, the grand chassis, the Dezous piece, the wood, which is more or less mass-produced, but everything else, there is something about the artist's touch with something known, like a materiality outside the artist, and then the artist doing something to it, which always felt like agency to me, and the whole movement became about a type of agency within making, which seems political because it is about someone doing something in real time and leaving it as an example somehow. And it's not a very loud position. The manifestos seem very boisterous and sort of like almost militaristic in some ways, but the act of making, which is throughout the show, shows a certain kind of intuitiveness and adventuresomeness and objectivity. There is this, I think I was using the word preciseness before, but there is a way that the making is very controlled and specific and designed for someone else to see and take. And the way that they made things seemed to come from somewhere else, like dyeing, weaving, any other sorts of verb, that sort of minimalist approach.
Yeah, and at the same time, they were very, that's totally right, but minimalist, but anti-minimalist in the sense of Judd, like they wanted
Wouldn't you
something
say
that's not
artisanal, perhaps?
I did say, yeah, artisanal, definitely artisanal, and I think it's also, maybe this is too simplistic, but the fact that the paintings are unstretched, that the work has a kind of intentionally nomadic quality. There's the great story of Claude Viala going to the Jean Fournier gallery and saying to Fournier, who's this great dealer in Paris, like, I'd like to show you my work. And Fournier says, well, yeah, I'm very busy, but I'll come to your studio. No, I want to show you my work. I want to show you my work. And Fournier looks at this young artist and realizes that that Viala has a suitcase with him. And he opens up the suitcase, and it's all his folded up paintings that he's brought to the gallery to show. Fournier falls in love with this work and goes on to show Viala for the rest of Fournier's life for many decades. But that sense of the nomadic quality, which partly Viala, as a young man, came to New York and went to the Museum of Natural History and was really struck by all the Plains Indians artifacts and objects on view. But that, maybe, as I said, it's too simplistic to read that as somehow political, but I think there is that they were intentionally making work that was not easily, did not resemble the kinds of valuable objects that were part of the history of Western art.
Well, I think an easy way to understand what they were trying to do is, in French, the word for visual art is art plastique, which is the art of forms and shape, and it implies the fact that it's actually, they are non-retinal artists, they are visual artists, they are physical artists, and one of the things that all of this work you'll see has in common is it's art you make with your hands, and that, I think, is one of the values that even whatever their disagreements were, whatever their aesthetic differences were, they all made art with their hands, and it was never, and that's one way in which they differ severely from what we think of as minimal art. Not one of them ever ended up doing stuff that they didn't do themselves. So that's to address that issue. But I want to say also something about, before we maybe close the political chapter. I think that, I'm not disagreeing with you entirely, but I think that their work is societal rather than political, in the sense that one of the most striking aspects of it, and one of the most federating aspects of it for them, was that it was art that wasn't supposed to go in galleries and museums, but that was a societal fact in France of the mid-60s. There were hundreds of exhibitions in those years outside of institutions that artists themselves, by word of mouth, brought each other together and invited each other, and it wasn't mail art, but there was a mail network, and also MALE, in which these artists who had in common their desire to make contemporary art, make art that was not conventional, art that was not bourgeois, but not necessarily like each other, but they would get invited and invite each other to all of these different cities for outdoor exhibitions or temporary exhibitions where they would kind of like homestead and take over spaces for a brief amount of time, but not always with authorization, because this was a period of great societal change in France, and it wasn't just only the change of revolution. In fact, they all inherit the much broader and important changes that happened to France after World War II, and which came with de Gaulle, which came with all of the social progress that was able to be put into place after World War II, and they are heir to that. And it's a great society time in France, and those years in which their young artists were called the 30 glorious years, because there's an incredible economic energy. Life is really pretty easy and good, and people are open-minded, and you can even fight the bourgeois without, taking too many risks. And this is they express that, and their joy in that work, and it remains as an artifact of a time when it was possible to do that with very little fear. This is work that knows no fear, and I think that's part of the energy maybe that we see in it. And maybe you interpret that as their political energy, but I interpret it as that they are benefiting from a moment in society that's very propitious to that.
That's beautifully put, and I think of it like maybe it is parallel to what happened with the Nouvelle Vague in films, starting a little bit earlier, but overlapping a lot, that sense of, and also engaging with history, with the history of the art form in a way where you feel you could kind of connect with the history, but also find ways still to radicalize it and to overthrow it, and that again, I guess the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers had a sense of companionship and solidarity with one another, that they were contributing and working off one another, and I think that also added, I think that it seems to me that these artists were inspiring and spurring one another on.
Yeah, I think that seems really apparent in the shows. I think I wrote in the essay that sometimes the work can feel like it's one artist, and sometimes it's 14, and that sort of mental thing where you're going back and forth, like, oh, it's so related, it's so similar, but there's also these other components, and it seems like such a difference to being a practicing artist today, where there's so much, it's almost like people are not in communication with each other. There's like a level of competition which is kind of antithetical to that sort of shared experience. That I'm off, this drags up a kind of a nostalgia for something I never experienced, which I think is what Rachel's kind of hinting at. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, it's very interesting. We sort of mentioned the fact that they didn't. The movement was the minute was actually could have been a movement. Like they had shows with the label Super So Fast. That was when it was dead pretty much, and it never actually existed as a movement, but it does exist as this group of works that we can still group together, and they're in their most competitive with each other. They never criticized each other for stealing each other's ideas or the competition is purely personal, finally, and that's interesting too. It's never aesthetic, and they all admire each other's works, even if they don't admire each other. And so I think the amazing thing is, yes, this vocabulary, this way of making art that has spoken to an audience 50 years later. And so maybe the next question is, do you still like their work? Or do you like their work now?
You mean the work that these artists are currently doing? Well, for instance, Pierre Bourraguet, who I just did this interview with, I think is, he said at one point in the interview, I pointed out that you change your work completely every 2 or 3 years. And he said, yes, that's why I have no market. But at the same time, an artist like Claude Viala, who's been using, you'll see his works where he uses the same shape that he started using in 1965 or 66, and he's now still, that's the only motif he uses in his paintings. It's this sort of, sometimes described as like a kidney bean shape. It actually comes from a sponge that's used to whitewash walls in France, in southern France. So his work, it's almost like a kind of cliche of the artist, the abstract artist who who just keeps doing the same motif over and over and over again. But what's amazing about Viala is he continues to find new ways to kind of activate and play with this shape, and to me that's really impressive.
No, it's like Agnes Martin. You think that she more or less made the same painting throughout her whole career, and then you see a lot of them, and the 80s ones look a little different than the 70s ones, and the shifts are so subtle, and it's almost like who's changing, the times or the artist? And with Claude, it certainly is that. Like the way the work has progressed over time, you begin to sort of see subtle changes that he may not even be totally in control of, that are just happening just because when and where he's making the pieces. But and to answer your question, I mean, it's much more easy to admire the work of all these artists in this box, putting them together, and as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to make something clean out of something that's kind of messy, and then to see the artist shooting off in all these sort of different directions and being very, as you say, holding on to this sense of fearlessness that they had in this work through time. It's very inconvenient for an audience in some ways to see them shift and change. Like, hey, whatever happened to that pliage stuff? I mean, it's like, so I think there's that human quality of like being disappointed when your band puts out an album that's a totally different genre and you're not into it suddenly.
At least 2 of these artists are now begin making figurative work.
Yeah, so that's really, I've seen some, and that's Vincent Boulez, and it's really hard to look at.
And Louis Kahn also.
Yeah, so it's like artists making things problematic for their audiences, which is part of what the project is in a certain sense. I think we're at about an hour. I thought maybe we could open it up if anyone has any questions in the audience, in the back.
Your favorite artist from the moment?
Oh, well, I'm not going to make any enemies, so I'll say Tony Khan.
Nice.
Because actually it's true. But in a way, he's very unrepresentative of Sudal Sofas, as are all the sculptors. They never had that problem about stretched or unstretched or the problem of representation in the same way that the pictoriality. It was the work that spoke to me first because it looks a lot more like sculpture that I could have Can's really most figurative paintings, and I think that his evolution is something, as you say, very inconvenient for the viewer, but interesting.
We had a microphone going around, guys, so.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to know who is best communicated from the group and why.
So as I recall, there was this journal, Peinture Cahiers Théoriques, painting theoretical notebooks, theoretical papers. And it was, I guess the first person, I think, as I recall, the first person who was either kind of excommunicated or pushed out from the group was Claude Viala, who in some senses like epitomizes, like if there's one artist who really epitomizes support surface, it's Claude Viala. And he was the first one to kind of be ejected from the hardcore, by the hardcore Maoists, Louis Kahn and Marc Devade. And I think, ironically, I always thought that Marc Devade's paintings, I think, are the most conservative, traditional, conventional paintings of the entire group. Yet he, in his like political discourse, was the most radical of them all. So I don't know whether that means it's hypocritical or an interesting contradiction, or I don't know what. But so those, and then
Was he upset when he got kicked out, do you think? Or?
I think he was. No, I don't think so. I think he was right. And then Pier Baraglio refused. I mean, he was not part of the official group, though his work is rightfully in the show, and he just refused to contribute to the journal or to be in the shows because of his political differences with the other members.
I mean, hanging the show is interesting because certain artists, they refuse to be next to each other. So I would hang the show, and I was like, this looks like $1 million. And then we take our phone out, scan around the room, and get approval quote, from France. And they're like, nope, you can't have these two guys together. If they saw that, that would be, verboten. So that's, so it's an unusual experience, hanging a show. I've never had to quite deal with it.
Hang a show by telephone?
Yeah, so.
As precedence, but.
And I was like, come on, really? And like, no.
But
It's
I think
this orthodoxy of support surface.
But also that they feel so strongly about this.
I couldn't believe that someone would hang on to that for so long. But yeah, it's true.
You have to remember that, their major conflict between them was never about politics. It was more urban versus southern, or urban versus regional. And although Louis Kahn is from the south, near Nice, which is where Viala taught and was the teacher of Noël Delat and Valency, he moved to Paris very quickly and he switched from the art school in Nice to the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he was very proud of that. And he met Devade in Paris, and he became more Parisian than anybody else. And there was always the artist most behind Peinture Cahiers Théoriques. Louis Kahn paid for it, so he was the publisher, so he was the most behind it, we can say that, were the Parisian point of view. And they were always in conflict with the idea that the other ones were provincial. And Devade was the only one with a university degree, a bachelor's in philosophy. So he felt that there was the conflicts are in those levels of personal.
Okay. We have another question?
I was just curious about the larger dialogue across Europe at that time. So, like the World Roman group out of Croatia, out of Zagreb, which I think is like 10 years before, and then Kolokusa from Poznań in Poland, was kind of active 10 years later. They sort of all kind of share
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that when we look back into that period, it's really important to remember how little people traveled and how little information and images traveled. And, you know, I think that a lot of, like, to me, like for instance, thinking about the German pop artists, Sigmar Polke and Gerhard Richter, who were like very influenced by American pop art, but they'd never actually seen any paintings. They just saw reproductions in magazines, and that kind of. So I think that maybe there were connections, maybe they were aware, but I think in general things were much more localized.
Yeah, the contact, they did have international contact with Italy and a little bit with Catalan artists from Spain, because you could drive there. So that was...
Right. Because they could take the train from Nice to Genoa or Barcelona.
So I'll try to make this into a question. So the work has... No? Yes?
Yeah, that's better.
So the work has the ability to migrate more simply than work that's more rigid, in terms of the sense of the surface and the support being separate entities. If you can fold them up and put them in a case and show them to a dealer, it allows for a kind of migratory exhibition. So what comes first, the ability for the migratory type exhibitions, or the work that allows for that?
You're the art critic. And you're the curator, so it's not my question.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, John, I don't think that Claude Viala was thinking, oh, this is going to be really smart. I don't stretch my paintings and I can fold them up and I can take them to Paris and get the gallery. I don't think it was not being strategic or even tactical about that. I think that, you know, I'm not, you know, it just raises questions like I suddenly realize I'm not entirely sure who was the first of these artists to embrace the unstretched canvas, and where exactly did that come from, and when did that come? Rachel, I don't know whether you have any insight into that. But...
You know, I've been looking because it's been attributed to Viala, because everyone has documented his first show of unstretched canvases. But that doesn't prove to me that Patrick Sétour, for instance, wasn't doing it at the same time. Patrick Sétour is the only one that I propose as possibly being the first, because they're the oldest, and I don't mean it's just the age is superior, but I mean Valencia and Dola were their students, so it's unlikely to me that they would have had the idea first.
You know, I'm thinking about one of the, you mentioned earlier, Rachel, the Nouveau Realistes, and I think that Nouveau Realiste work where they were working with materials from everyday life and taking posters from the streets and from the subways and just tearing them off and taking them into the gallery or back to their studios or their hotels. I think in some ways, maybe that was one of the, it maybe didn't come from painting per se, and it was kind of something that migrated from one art form to another, and somehow, if you kind of combine Jacques de la Villeblaye and Raymond Haas and Morris Louis and Clement Greenberg essay and Hantai.
Put that all in a blender.
Hantai. I mean, that's probably where it comes from. Hantai.
We have one more question. Oh, sorry, Joe. Maybe one more, and then we'll take it.
Yeah, over here. That better?
Yeah, thanks.
During your discussions, I noticed kind of a conflict or dichotomy. You were saying how the artists themselves were very kind of satisfied on the local level and having some sort of notoriety within the community and kind of staying small scale. But then at the same time in your discussions, you were talking about how it was trying to be interjected on a national or international level, and it was kind of negative connotations I was hearing about it being, you know, not well received or things of that nature. And I was just wondering, do you think this negativity or this kind of dismissal of this movement, is that because people weren't ready for it? Was this not something that the artists themselves were looking for? Or is this negativity somewhere else, and was it even intended to get to that international level, or was it intended to stay more localized?
I mean, in the case of New York, it was just out and out contempt for French art. There's an article by Peter Sheldall in the early 80s, and it's called, the title is something like, "Why French Art is So Lousy," or why New French Art is So Lousy. And he talks about Viola in this article, and there was just this ingrained notion and that, you know, French art was inferior to, a pale imitation of, and just not as good as New York. And so I think that certainly was one of the things that stopped them from getting.
And they didn't speak English. You know, all those French artists that did make it here before them, Armand spoke English, Bernard Benet spoke English, Nikita Saint-Phal spoke English, so that generation of artists made friends, and that helps too.
I'd like to, thank you. Hi. Okay, let's just piggyback on that, because I find first, this is an amazing exhibition, and I think it would be really appropriate, would it be really appropriate to say, given the importance of the province and the whole self-identification in support of us, and the tension with Paris, why an exhibition like this would be really interesting to have in Detroit, in a space like this in Detroit. This is a superb exhibition, and it's really, really thoughtfully installed. But there's so many things here where why Support of Us is absolutely obsessed with that. If you read back to Cahiers Théoriques, they translate Greenberg, they translate Robert Motherwell. You do not mention at all Philippe Solers. If you're going to talk about Maoism, you can't do that without talking about Solers. You're going to talk about Marcin Plenet, because Marcin Plenet, you say they don't travel, but they reprint lots of conversations of their friends at the Museum of Modern Art, talking about French art, also modern Cézanne, etc., at the Museum of Modern Art. Marcin Plenet, every single article that he writes about American art when he's traveling in America, and that is then published in the Literature, the Communist Review, they devour them. Marcin Plenet says in the Sorbonne Pompidou exhibition devoted to them, that the moment he got back from America, Support Surface were knocking at his door, and all they wanted to talk about was the state of American art. So I think part of the thing here is to construct what they get out of American art, consistent with the type of materialism that they're exploring. Because if you're going to talk about politics, and I must say, I find what you say about politics, their attitude to politics, slightly condescending. The question is not whether it's true. The question is, did they believe it? Did they believe it at the time? And in the language that they were using, it's not the image, it's the processes of materialism. It's materialism that is political. And then what do we understand by that? And Marcin Plenet and Solers were incredibly important for them as a bridge between not minimalism, but post-minimalism, the type of thing that we saw in the Whitney's Art and Illusion in 1969, the type of thing that we saw in When Attitudes Became Form. It was the materialism that they saw as political, and that, or the basis of a political way of thinking about art processes. And American art and American culture is in fact incredibly important. And I think it would really be useful to say what was their construction of the image of America in this extraordinary, this avant-garde got to have a journal. And they had a major journal. And in that journal, 200, 300 pages long, they published it increasingly. Italy's not that well presented, Germany's not that well presented. It's the United States that they're talking about, and their friends, the Vargas in Quebec, at the same time that Celeste is in America, at the same time that René is traveling across America. And I think that that process, that enculturation and that construction of the image of the United States is absolutely essential to their self-understanding as an avant-garde.
You absolutely, and you know, definitely, you know, they do interviews with them. They often credit Marcelin Plenet, poet and art critic, as you say, is like the person who really brought them ideas about American painting, about Greenberg and about post-war American abstraction. And and Philippe Solers and Tel Quel, and in many ways the peinture Cahiers Théoriques is a sort of the visual art kind of arm of Tel Quel. But one of the things, and as you say, there's like a kind of post-minimalist international artistic kind of movement going on. But one of the things that I find really interesting, and interestingly in a kind of interesting contradiction, is that most post-minimalist art was about rejecting painting. Like Art Pauvre, they didn't really care about painting. The American post-minimalists, a lot of them did not care about painting. There were some exceptions, and I think you can certainly see, like, if you look at the work of some Americans in the 70s, there were like very strong affinities with what the surface artists were doing. But what I find really interesting is that through, often, as you say, through their exposure and introduction, through the articles and writings of Marcelin Plenet, that they engaged in formalist and Greenbergian formalism, and which seems to be so like the last thing you would do if you were assuming the kinds of radical Maoist positions that they like.
Raphael, sorry to interrupt. Can you remember, as an art critic, formalism used to be Marxist. Formalism used to be Marxist. That is where Jacobson comes from. And, a certain kind of formalist film in the 60s is, materialist film is Marxist. Formalism used to be Marxist.
That's completely true. And it's also what you said about peinture Cahiers Théoriques is completely true. However, this regional split that I was talking about is also completely true. And aside from Viala, Plenet did not defend any of those other artists who are completely part of Support Surface. So there were other critics also, like Bernard Lamarche-Vadel or Jacques Lepage, or even the Art Presse, Catherine Millet, did not have exactly the same artists that they were defending. So there's this regional thing, which is one thing, and the other is the timing. I think that the pre-Support Surface time, which I think is the time that they're most Support Surface, they were not very concerned by American art because they were involved in they weren't that outward looking. And at that time when they were participating in all of these group shows, these kind of spontaneous shows, they were very much in contact with Italian artists and with Catalan artists and with different artists from other parts of France. So the American thing is absolutely true, but a bit later, is how I would put it.
I think that's, well, you have the last word for now. We can keep talking later, obviously. I'm sure we will.
Yeah, it seems like we've moved in from questions to conversations best had
Yes.
over a glass of wine.
Yes.
So please, the bar is open.